I was joking. Unless.
Okay.
Hello, Angela and Toby. We're going to first go over the answers to the questions of Chapter 11, the student work of Chapter 11, and then begin the lecture over Chapter 11 after that, and just keep right on going. John, you've read John 44, 1 through 42. And here's the first question. Why do you think John interjects a comment, in verse 9 that the Jews did not associate with the Samaritans? Hannah.
To show that back then they had prejudice and that he looked past it and didn't show prejudice.
Yeah, when John wrote this, he was likely in Ephesus in Turkey. So it's possible that, the Jews obviously they would know, but some of his readers probably wouldn't. So he was maybe making sure that they knew about that. Anybody have something else? What'd you have? Elijah, you were going to say something.
I assume just what she said.
Just what she said?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not, but that's okay. What did Jesus mean by living water? Let's answer that one first. What's the living water?
Eternal life in Jesus.
Okay, eternal life in Jesus. It's something only Jesus can give. He gives living water, but he also is living water. And then what's the difference between the water in the well and this living water?
The water in the well would quench your thirst temporarily.
Right, but the living water is eternal and can quench our spiritual thirst eternally. So yeah, the living water quenches our spiritual thirst permanently, and the water from the well quenches our physical thirst temporarily. And that's another difference. That this living water is quenching this need inside of us for salvation, for meaning, for relationship with God spiritually. And then the water in the well is quenching our thirst, our physical thirst. Anybody have anything to add to that? Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Why did Jesus tell the woman to go get her husband when he knew she did not currently have a husband? Why would she ask that? Hannah?
Maybe to show her that he already knew everything about that situation.
Yeah, probably so that she would recognize something about Jesus, that she would see that he knew already. And it freaked her out, right? She's like, whoa, how do you know that? So he is probably wanting her to recognize who he is a little bit. Now, Jake talked about helping her see her sin, and I think that's part of it as well. Certainly, seeing her sin needs to happen before she can become a follower of Christ, before she can believe in him, and that happens as well. So I think that definitely both are possible answers, and both might both be true. He might have been trying to do more than one thing there. What did Jesus mean when he said a time was coming when neither a mountain in Samaria nor Jerusalem would be the center of worship? What's he talking about?
Jesus would die and our bodies would be our place of worship because the Holy Spirit is in us now.
Yeah, so we'd be able to worship anywhere. That the time, he's saying the time of the prophecies that said, I will put my spirit into my people and they will worship me in spirit and in truth. Those prophecies, he's foreshadowing that time that would come. And foreshadowing, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed about 30-ish, 40-ish years after Jesus dies. So we would be worshiping God in our hearts, worshiping God with our lives, without grab the thing. All of that is true. Good answers. Imagine for a moment that you are the woman It's going to be harder for some of you than others. Wouldn't it be embarrassing for you to go inside the city to tell the men that Jesus knew everything about you? There's some embarrassing stuff in there, right? What would cause you to tell everyone about him so excitedly? Grace?
It was more important to her about who Jesus was than what she had done.
It was more important to her to tell people of who Jesus was. Suddenly her past didn't matter because she'd met Christ. Suddenly her sin, even her exposure to shame, was not what was important. Who Jesus was and what Jesus had told her was far more important than who he is, than any embarrassment over her past life. They already knew all about that anyway. Questions on this? Okay, great. If you would please turn the page to the teacher lesson. And let me get set up here. That's not where I wanted to be. No, thank you. And that's the one this is the story, as we've already said, of the woman at the well, and we're going to begin actually in John 3 to give us some context of what's happening just before that. What was the main story of John 3? Nicodemus and his meeting with Jesus. So now we're going to have another conversation taking place. So after this meeting with Nicodemus, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. So Jesus had been in Jerusalem, which is in Judea, and he's going to leave Jerusalem and he's going to go to Galilee. But remember that John, in his gospel, deals primarily with Judea, with Jerusalem in Judea. You can see here on this map, and it doesn't show us Judea, but Judea is down here where Jerusalem is. Samaria is in between, and then Galilee is up here near the Sea of Galilee. And he is somewhere in the Judean countryside, so outside of Jerusalem, baptizing, or his disciples are baptizing. The curriculum says that this is where he was baptizing, or likely where he was baptizing. Here's what we know. It was in the Judean countryside, and there had to be water to baptize. So maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't. I'm not sure we can know for sure where it was. And then in the first few verses of chapter 4, it kind of sets the occasion. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. So he is realizing that maybe his popularity is growing to a point that he's not ready for it to grow, so he moves on. He was in complete control of what was going to happen. He knew he was born to die. He knew he was going to die on a cross and pay for the sins of the world. And so this was time for him to leave, and he knew it. Because he orchestrated the timing of his death. He knew that his hour had not yet come. And so much of what he did was because his hour had not yet come. So he ran from popularity, and he was becoming more popular, and he ran from that because it wasn't time for him to die yet. And he ran from death before it was time for him to die. When the time came, he was very resolute about it. Because God had ordained a specific time, not only for Jesus to die, but for Jesus to be born. Here's what Paul tells us in Galatians 4. But in the fullness, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. In the fullness of time means at the exact right time, Jesus was born. And at the exact right time, he died. And it's not that time yet. So his movements have everything to do with timing and God's will. Because he had a specific purpose, and that was to accomplish his Father's will. Jesus was dedicated to his Father's will. So we see in verse 4, he goes to Samaria, and he had to pass through Samaria. There's a lot of interesting things here, but let's just begin with Samaria and with where he went. More specifically, he went, I don't know why they made this so weird looking, but more specifically, so now you see down here is Judea, and up here is Galilee, and you see Samaria, and more specifically, he went to this town of Sychar. And Sychar was quite famous in biblical times. It's just a little town that is nestled between two, they call them mountains, we might call them hills, between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and there is what Sychar looks like. It's a small town. And I believe the one on the left is Mount Ebal, and the one on the right is Mount Gerizim, but that might be backwards. But here is where Joshua gathered the tribes of Israel and distributed their land, and then he had someone standing on one of the mountains and one on the other, and they shouted out the blessings that would come if they obeyed God. And then on the other mountain, they shouted out the curses or the bad things that would happen if they disobeyed God. Because blessing comes with obedience, and heartache and bad things come with disobedience. If your life just seems to be messed up and screwed up and you don't know why, are you obeying God? Just like a parent disciplines a child for good, God disciplines us when we disobey. And so blessing comes with obedience. I used to say to my kids when they were little frequently, it will go better for you if you obey Mom. And the same is true. It goes better for us when we obey God. And so they're shouting out these blessings and curses, and when they get done, Joshua is like, you need to serve the Lord. You need to serve God. Do you need a quiz?
Yeah.
I will get it for you. Just a second, Angela and Toby. Are you already taking the study hall?
Yeah.
Okay, or are you in your mom's room?
I went.
Okay, so make sure your mom knows this.
What am I getting?
So Joshua is telling them that they need to serve the Lord, they need to obey the Lord, and they say, "We will obey the Lord," and then they don't, and they, it all goes badly for them. But it doesn't all go badly. But that's this town where Jesus is, sandwiched between Judea and in Samaria, which is sandwiched between Judea and Galilee. Now, Samaria got its name from a town that was named that. The town was named Samaria, but it came to be the whole area. How did the Samaritans come to be, and how did they end up hating each other so much? Well, as you probably know from the Bible, the Assyrians came in and defeated Israel and took people captive to Assyria. And then a couple hundred years later, maybe it was a couple hundred years later. I think it was in the 500s, and this is in 700 BC. So the Babylonians came in and they defeated Jerusalem and defeated Judah, and they took the Judeans captive to Babylon. And when the Assyrians came in and when the Babylonians came in and took away all the wealthy people, all the learned people, they left behind a remnant of Israel. And they also left behind soldiers and people to rule the country. Those people who were born Judeans or born Israelites intermarried with the foreign people from the Assyrian Empire and from the Babylonian Empire. And those people, those children and their children and their children were known as Samaritans. From a Jewish perspective, they were a mixed race and they were heathens. Now they had a theology, and we're going to see in this discussion with Jesus that there was a theology that took from the scriptures, from the Old Testament scriptures, as well as from the heathen nations. They kind of had this mixed up Judaism as their theology. So they were looked on as a mixed breed, as a mixed race with a heathen core. And they were looked upon with disgust and disdain from by the Jewish people. So this animosity toward one another was mutual. The Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews. And we do tend to hate those who hate us, right? When I was in middle school, there was I'm not going to say her last name, maybe somebody's heard of her before, I don't know. She's probably married, probably not, because she's not around. I'm not going to say that. And there's this girl named Gail, and for whatever reason, and I never knew why, she hated me. And she really treated me badly and said horrible things about me. And we moved away. I was in mission for 1.5 years, and then we moved away to Europe and came back, and lo and behold, I was in high school with Gail as well. And again, I mean, she was just, and she kind of constantly, she walked around like this. Like she was better than everyone else. And so I hated her right back, because she hated me, you know? And that's kind of what happened. She's probably a perfectly lovely 58-year-old woman somewhere, but and I've forgiven her. But that's what happened here. They were hated, and so they hated back. And at some point, people don't really even know why they hate other people. They just always have. And that's what happened with the Jews and the Samaritans. But Jesus decides to go right through Samaria. And to give you an idea of the animosity, many Jews, because when you go, so you've got Galilee here and you've got Jerusalem. What's the fastest way to get from Galilee to Jerusalem? Right through Samaria. But many Jews chose instead to go outside, to go around in Perea and come down here, to go out of their way to not have to deal with the Samaritans. Jesus chooses to go right through there. He intentionally chooses to go right through there because he knows he has business to do with this Samaritan woman. Even though going through Samaria was the most direct route, and the one that many people didn't take, he knew that this woman needed him. And he wanted also, I believe, to teach his disciples an important lesson about racial prejudice and evangelism. What does this passage teach believers about racial prejudice? You've just read it. What do you think? But that's not the answer.
define like their worth or their lovability.
Yeah, it doesn't define us. What we look like on the outside doesn't define us. It shouldn't define us with other people. And it certainly doesn't define us with God. Everybody matters to God. God loved the world, not a particular race, not a particular